Welcome everybody. We'll get started in a couple minutes. All right. Hey everybody. Got a pretty good group so far. So most of you, I think, through the settings entered the webinar with your video off and on mute. So you're welcome to have your video on and off. But if you would keep your microphone on mute, that would be great. And then if you have any questions throughout the webinar, you are welcome to hold them to the end or drop them in the chat. And I will try to keep an eye on that as we move through things as best I can, so I can try to answer some things as we go and catch up with questions at the end as well. In the chat, I'm going to go ahead and share. We'll be recording the webinar and I'll post it online afterwards. And then I also added some resources and a PDF copy of the slides of this presentation to a site, a page on the HIP website. So I just put the link there in the chat and I will share that again at the end as well. So that'll be available if you want to go back through some of the resources I shared here or look at the slides again or share them with someone else. So with that, So we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to the first ever Hamilton County Invasive Species Awareness Week. Really exciting to have this initiative happening in the county. It goes along with the National Invasive Species Awareness Week. And so far, this past week, we have opened our first boot brush station at Cool Creek Park. Had multiple weed wrangles, which are volunteer work days, and had a big push online, launching our new website and sharing a lot of resources online through our social media channels as well. So very excited to welcome you all to this webinar where we are going to just touch on an introduction to invasive species and how native plants can be used as a solution to some of the issues that invasives create. To my right screen here. I see a lot of familiar names attending, but it's a lot of new people too, so that's exciting. My name is Claire Lane. I'm the urban conservationist at the Hamilton County Soil and Water Conservation District, and I also coordinate the Hamilton County Invasives Partnership, which is a project of the SWC addressing invasive species in Hamilton County. So tonight, we're going to keep things, as a true introduction. We're not going to get very far deep into specific invasive species, but we're going to talk about, the concept of native versus invasive species, why that even matters. We will touch briefly on some invasives, not going to get into any management details or anything like that today. And then we'll talk a bit about how native plants can be a solution, and I'll share some resources as well. So there's so much you can cover with invasive species. So we really just wanted this to be kind of a primer to help you understand the basic concepts, and then you can take advantage of different resources online or being a part of HIP or other training opportunities to learn more about more identification or management. Can you guys hear me okay? This is very quiet. Is that better? Somebody could put it in the chat, or me, I can see you. Can you hear me better? Okay, I'll do it without that. Okay, so yeah, let's jump right in. So first off, what is a native species? The textbook definition that HIP uses and that's settled on in the community is a plant or animal that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. That's a mouthful, but the really important part of it is what I've underlined there, the complex and essential relationships part. And we'll get a little bit further into that. The picture in the background is a purple passion flower. And it'd be a good time to, I got a lot of the photos and slides and information in this presentation from Dawn Slack from the Nature Conservancy. But that goes to show what a beautiful, how beautiful and unique our native plants could be. Is this any better? Might just bring you guys in closer and speak loud. That's better. Okay, hopefully this is better. So there we go. Do natives really matter? What's the whole story about? So we really recognize now that all species are important, not just the big keystone species in any one ecosystem. And comparing it to Jenga, it's kind of saying, I'm sorry, I have some people telling me each way I go that it's worse for them, so I'm not sure which way to go. We'll try this again. So, a Jenga tower is at its strongest whenever it has all of its pieces in the right place, building a lot of strength. And it's the same thing with our ecosystems. We have a lot of specialist and generalist species. So many species on our planet are specialists, like monarchs is a really good example that monarchs need milkweed to complete their life cycles. So, sorry, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat and it's really hard. But 90% of our herbivorous insects are specialists, so they depend on certain species. And then the key issue there is it takes a long time to develop that relationship where an insect can exploit a plant effectively. Let's see, maybe that'll help. So insects must evolve to find their host plant amid thousands of other plants out in the ecosystem in their habitat, and then synchronize their life cycle with the needed part of their host. So that's not happening over the course of one generation of any species. That's happening over thousands of years. Yay, figured it out. Thanks, Amy. So they have to also overcome any physical or chemical defenses that plant has to form that relationship. And they do that through behavioral changes and physiological changes. So over these thousands or even longer stretches of time, they're developing these really specialized relationships so that these plants and these insects end up depending on each other to complete their life cycles. So that's why those relationships are really important, because when they get disrupted, that's where a lot of the issues start to happen in our ecosystems for invasive species. So natives really help insects, and insects are really important in our ecosystem. 37% of wildlife on the planet are herbivorous insects, and 96% of birds eat insects. And of that 96%, 60% rely completely on insects. So whenever you consider how many insects are needed to help these each clutch grow. For example, one clutch of chickadees needs 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. That's just one clutch. So you extrapolate that out over how many insects or just caterpillars are needed just to raise the 60% of birds that rely completely on insects. And then, of course, other animals eat insects too, amphibians, even humans. And it's a big issue because in the last couple of years, research came out, a 27-year-long study in Europe found a 75% decline in flying insects over that time period. So that study also proposed cascading effects on food webs and likely those systems falling apart and those insects disappearing, jeopardizing really valuable ecosystem services that our economy and ecosystem health depend on. So it's a good time to kind of think about how things change, and you can pull anecdotal evidence just out of our own lives. And a good way to think about that is windshields over the course of just your lifetime. I think about when I was little, you'd go on a road trip, your windshield would often be covered in insects, and really that rarely happens anymore. So we can kind of see that anecdotal evidence reinforcing some of these things that are being borne out in research as well. And we know that greater structural diversity of plant communities leads to greater insect diversity. So that actual physical structure of the ecosystem is really tied to the insect diversity, which cascades all the way up to birds and other animals. We also really depend on insects and pollinators for a lot of different things. Medicines, food, of course, beverages, fibers. There's over 1,000 plants grown for those things that need to be pollinated by animals, and 1 in 3 mouthfuls directly or indirectly relies on honeybee pollination. So some of my favorites there, apples, blueberries, chocolate, coffee, for sure, all depend on animal pollination. And our pollinators really depend on those diverse ecosystems of native plants. So a few years ago, a Whole Foods out east somewhere did a little visual demonstration. On the left there, you see a produce department that has it's fully stocked, and then they went through and took out all of the produce that was dependent on bees for pollination. You can see there wasn't very much left. So a really good visual demonstration of how important pollinators are to our food supply, which goes into our, of course, our economy, but also human health and stability, community and cultural stability as well. So now that we know a little bit about native species and our pollinators, what is an invasive species? So there's really two components to that. It's non-native, so it's not from this area, and it causes harm to the environment, human health, and the economy. And there's a lot of information or data and financial figures backing up the impacts that invasive species are having across the whole spectrum. So they found that the annual environmental, medical, and economic cost is actually greater than the cost of all other natural disasters combined. Of course, it's happening over a longer period of time and maybe not as, spectacular or dramatic visually as some of these disasters that happen all at once, and you can see the impact. So it's easier for invasive species issues to go unnoticed by the average population. You can see there, and they're infesting a lot of national park lands. They're a huge threat to endangered species in our forest ecosystems. There hasn't been a lot of study about the financial impact specific to Indiana, but one study there, or survey that was done in 2012, found that just across 116 landowners, which is not many at all, they spent more than $5 million on invasive species management. And we know that that's only growing and growing each year. And you can imagine, on the bigger scale, of course, more than 116 landowners are doing invasive species management. So what are some of those consequences? Invasive species cost the US about $138 billion a year. 25% of Indiana flora is non-native. About $7 billion in forest products are lost annually in the US because of invasive species, and 42% of endangered species are at risk due to invasives. So invasives contribute really rapidly to rapid environmental changes that are causing extinction rates, extinctions to happen faster than the evolution of new species can catch up. So that kind of sets us behind. There we go. Behind because those specialized relationships can't stay on top of the really rapid environmental changes that are happening. I'm not going to go through all of these. So there are a lot of consequences. We could sit here for an hour and talk about any one of these specific consequences of invasive species. But outside of the ecological consequences, that are, very significant human health issues. And the thing we often don't talk about too is just the loss of our native plant heritage and plants that have cultural significance to different communities. And whenever we lose native plants, whenever we've lost some really unique plants, and a loss of beauty that ties into recreation and just kind of like the passive enjoyment of our ecosystems. That's something that, on top of all of those other consequences, really means a lot to me, and is part of why I'm passionate about managing invasive species and native plants. So we'll touch really quickly on just a couple of the most common ones. Again, you could spend an hour on any of these invasive species, especially when you get into management. We're just going to touch a little bit on identification of some of the big main ones we deal with in Hamilton County. So a big focus that we have now is the Bradford or Calorie pear, you might have heard it called. That encompasses a lot of different cultivars. So Cleveland Select, Bradford, Aristocrat, all of those we kind of package up under the term Calorie pear. And you see these all over the place. They're on the shorter side for a tree, multi-branched. They are the first tree to really bloom out in those white flowers each year. Then they have a small brownish fruit in the fall that persists through winter. Alternate leaves, really glossy, simple. They have small teeth. And the problem is that being native to China, Taiwan, a lot of places in Southeast Asia, they were introduced to the landscape trade. There were several cultivars created that they thought were sterile, or they bred them to be sterile. But the problem was, whenever they had all of these different sterile cultivars, they were planted close enough to each other that they were able to cross-pollinate and actually reproduce and produce fertile stock. So as you can see in that photo there, they have started rapidly spreading into our natural areas. So what we would call escaping cultivation. And it's really dramatic to see the impact they have each spring, because they're that first thing to bloom out white flowers each spring. So it's really dramatic to see just how far they've spread. They really grow very fast. They can start flowering and reproducing from seed at just 3 years. These photos here are all photos from Hamilton County. On the right there, a popular spot where a lot of people complain about each year is 38 in State Road 38 in Hague. They're in Noblesville, but they are absolutely all over. So it flowers and fruits profusely, and birds spread it very efficiently. As I mentioned, these trees were planted mostly in the landscape trade, really common in a lot of like our newer communities, homeowners associations. They were common as landscape trees in new developments, and street trees as well. Unfortunately, we found that they're not a very long-lived tree, and they have a really weak branch structure. So whenever there's ice storms or a lot of wind, you can't go very far at all before you're seeing Calorie pear branches broken. It's a really big expense for our cities as well to try to clear streets and right-of-ways after storms because of Calorie pear. They also smell terrible in the spring whenever they bloom, kind of like a rotten fish smell. If you ever notice that out on the walk in the spring, it's probably Calorie pear. They really thrive in any kind of unmowed, disturbed habitat. So roadsides, fields, places that have been cultivated and then maybe left fallow. And again, they grow really fast, so it doesn't take long for them to take over. And the big problem there is, on top of the fact of how fast they spread, is that they are very difficult to manage. So when they are naturalized, they can form really sharp spines, sharp enough and strong enough that they can even puncture tractor tires. So they can grow so thick and so rapidly, and then with these spines, it really makes management really challenging to even penetrate these thickets, and then also finding the right combination of like mechanical and chemical treatment to even control them has been proving to be a really big challenge for land managers. Bush honeysuckle is a really common one, again, native to Japan and Asia. The first thing typically to leaf out in the spring, so they're able to shade out our native plants that would otherwise be growing in the forest understory, leading to big decreases in herbaceous species and new tree seedlings that allow us to get regeneration of our forest ecosystems. It's got those now, most of places, it's to its flowering stage. So you'll see the yellow, white flowers there. And then in the fall, red berries. It's got opposite leaves and hollow stems. If you were to cut one, you'd see the hole there in the middle. And they've even found in some studies that honeysuckle monocultures decrease nesting sites for birds and actually decreases their reproductive success as well. And a lot of people will say that the berries of the honeysuckle, they're basically like empty carbs for birds. So instead of getting the complex carbohydrates and protein they need to be able to migrate successfully or reproduce successfully, they eat these honeysuckle berries, and they're basically just empty sugar bombs. So you can see here, this is a photo of bush honeysuckle. It's a monoculture of that forest understory. It's the only thing there because you can see it's leafing out before everything else. So it shades out everything else that would have otherwise, all the natives that would have otherwise been thriving in that understory woods habitat. Burning bush, unfortunately, another really common one from the landscape trade. It's a large shrub, really popular in landscape planting because it has that really beautiful, brilliant fall red color, not reed color. It has inconspicuous flowers about, through this time each spring. Opposite, dark green leaves, less than 2 inches long. They kind of taper a little bit at the tips there, and then you can see burning bush or winged burning bush, it's commonly called. You can see on the stem there. Got my pointer there. These little kind of like paper parts along the stem. That's why they refer to it as a winged burning bush. You can see the fruits here, this bottom picture. And burning bush is, it's hard with a lot of these invasive species because they are quite beloved really by, people that, people form relationships with their plants. And they're beautiful, so it's easy for people to really, have a really strong attachment to their plants. And then I always like to point out when I talk about burning bush that people think, oh, well, it's not mine. Mine isn't spreading. It's not suckering. It hasn't spread to other parts of my yard. Not realizing that the issue with these invasive species isn't that they're going to take over your yard. It's that they are escaping to the roadsides and woodland habitat and taking over there. So it has that pretty fruit, but again, it's the birds that are eating that fruit in your yard and then flying over to a roadside or a woodland or a park that you love and planting that seed there. And then you can see in this photo in the bottom right how they can take over the understory and create a monoculture there, shading out the native plants. Japanese barberry, another one that invades forests and forms really dense thickets. This one can actually, the leaf litter can alter the soil chemistry. It's got another pretty, red color, an alternate leaf arrangement. You can see another photo there in the bottom left of it taking over a forest understory. Barberry is another one, or one that they have tied to that issue, if you remember, in the definition of invasive species, that they impact human health. Barberry thickets, they form these really sharp thorns, which makes management difficult for humans, of course, but it also makes penetration by predators in these woodlands pretty complicated. So it is a good environment where mice and other rodents can thrive because predators can't get in the thicket to hunt them. And of course, mice can be a vector for tick populations. So they have found connections between barberry thickets, increases in mice, increases in ticks, and then increases in Lyme disease. So that's kind of how some of these invasive species can tie into human health issues. Winter creeper is another really, unfortunately, common one. It's another one of those invasive vines like English ivy or periwinkle. Winter creeper vines can climb 40 to 50 feet into really mature, beautiful native trees, killing shrubs and trees along the way. They can form a really dense carpet, basically, whenever they're on the ground. And block the germination of native species. Whenever it starts to climb, it gets a little more woody. It's got those glossy kind of oval leaves with little tiny teeth. It's green stems all year, so a really popular landscape plant, but really easily escapes that cultivated setting into the wild as well. Sweet-autumn clematis. There are a lot of different clematis species out there. This one in particular is a challenge for land managers because the seeds are wind dispersed. So you see it a lot along highways because trucks or along like train tracks, those kind of thoroughfares are a great way for seeds to get distributed. It climbs over other vegetation, smothering it. It does, it's beautiful and has a pleasant odor, but I'll show you, in the next slide. what kind of devastation it can do whenever it smothers other species. So that brings up another issue with some of these native plants, or I'm sorry, invasive plants, is that they spread so rapidly that people want to divide them and share them because they can be overgrowing their habitat in the yard. So people will think, oh, this is beautiful, I love it, I have so much of it, I'm going to share it with my friends and neighbors. And that's how a lot of these invasives can spread around. So then we'll see on this next slide 2 habitat areas. You can see all of that dense green foliage is Sweet-on Clematis that has formed a thick mat and absolutely grown over everything in these habitats. Okay, and another quick note, turf, from our yard, not necessarily what you would call invasive, but absolutely, certainly not a native species. And I like to bring it up because, it's part of a trend that we have for increased use of non-native plants in the landscape. And it really alters the habitat that we have. So we've inverted, a lot of what used to be a vibrant habitat to what's pretty sterile. Now, there's over 40 million acres of turf grass in the U.S., and that accounts for 30 to 70% of household water use in the high season to keep it watered and green. But it's really pretty much sterile ecologically and very resource intensive to maintain. A lot of time, a lot of air quality issues, really high inputs of water and different chemicals to kind of, have that green carpet lawn. So that also contributes to a lot of water quality issues. Whenever you think about all the fertilizers or herbicides that can wash away. The EPA has even estimated that there's over 17 million gallons of fuel spilled each year while refueling just lawn equipment. And thinking about the air pollution, one of those, resource intensive inputs, 1 hour of mowing produces the same amount of air pollution as a 100-mile car trip because most of our lawn equipment doesn't have any emission controls. So what's the answer to all of this? The good thing is, there's a lot of land management challenges that come with invasive species, but focusing on the beauty and strength of our native plants and working to increase that plant diversity and insect and wildlife diversity is something that we can do whether we have a balcony or we have 100 acres. And a good way to get started with that is with the native plants. So Dr. Doug Tallamy has done a lot of research, starting just, he's an entomologist, I believe, but starting just on his own property, and he's expanded that out into more research. He has looked at these relationships between insects in our native plants and non-native plants. And you have a chart on this slide here that shows some native plant species and the number of moth or butterfly species that are supported. So oaks, are a big heavy hitter as far as the insect support goes. There's over 534 different species that are supported by different oak species. Cherry is right up there too, 456, and has some of those really important relationships whenever you talk about like providing habitat or food for specific species like the eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly. Depends on cherry species. Maples, 285. Maple leaf viburnum is another one that has that really dependent relationship with the Henry elfin. And then you can see that they support other pollinators too, wasps, flies, all of those things. But then you look over, this next slide has that same chart, and then also some invasive species, and researchers have looked at the number of insects found utilizing those species, and the really dramatic differences there. Clumping bamboo is only 1, tree of heaven is 2 species, bush honeysuckle is 5 species. So when you go back and think about those relationships, those specialized relationships, whenever our really diverse native habitats that can support so many hundreds of different species are replaced with monocultures of some of these invasive plants, it drops so far the host opportunities for all of these insects populations as well. So if you're interested specifically learning more about some of this insect stuff and some of this research, Bringing Nature Home is Doug Talmey's first book, and he has another one out now that I didn't add in here, but they're both available at the library and of course, bookshops and Amazon. But it's a really user-friendly. It's an easy read, I would say. You don't have to be, a scientist to understand the concepts he's presented in these books. And he's also a really good photographer and has some great photographs of some of these insects as well. So I would encourage you to check that out if you'd like to learn more about some of those specific relationships and how natives support those insect populations. So a lot of what I do at the SWCD is helping people, make better choices or solve natural resource issues on their properties, and helping them understand that your choices at home make a difference for natives and invasives and water quality and a lot of other different topics. But sharing that message with others is also really important. And we hope you'll be able to do that today whenever you've learned and hopefully, chosen to make some changes on your property. So what we're really going for there is creating and preserving healthy, diverse habitat. And that's possible on all different scales, whether you have a suburban yard or whether you have acres or a farm, or maybe you don't have any property necessarily, but you can be active as an advocate, as a volunteer or financially toward preserving some of our healthy, diverse habitats or making improvements as volunteers to parklands and other habitats. Those choices all make a really big difference. For those of you that do have property that you are interested in making some changes on, landscaping with native plants is increasingly popular as people recognize the benefits, but also the beauty that comes with native plants. A lot of people in their mind think, oh, natives, or that's weeds. But it's important that people know that native plants can be as natural or wild, maybe we could say, looking, or as manicured as you want. It all comes down to how you approach it, how you plant it, and how you maintain your planting. It could be a small area or your whole yard. The same design principles apply to landscaping and natives as they would with any other non-native species. Putting taller plants in the back or up against your fence, as you can see in this bottom photo. Not necessarily saying that all of these are native, but some of these design principles. Planting in clumps of the same color. You can see here the grass in the back, and then clumps of pink flowers here. Repeating groupings or things that our brains are really geared to pick up on. So you can see repeating yellow and yellow. Things like that, different colors and textures and shapes, whether you're using non-native plants or native plants, those are the things that still make a landscape planting beautiful. And of course, mixing in hardscapes and things like that, using boulders, fencing, different elements of care are all things that are important. Whenever you're landscaping with native plants, you can use plugs or smaller plants for more of an instant gratification, or if you really want a manicured landscape look, that way you can choose exactly where each plant goes. But if you have more area, maybe more time, or want a more natural kind of meadow look, you could use seed as well. Also depends on what your budget is, of course. And we won't get into a lot of that here, but I did want to point out that we have a lot of resources online through the SWCD, and we also do workshops and presentations specifically about how you would go about implementing some of these native plantings. And I can share more of those afterwards in a follow-up email as well. So another challenge with these native plants is the that public perception of native plants. Maintenance. A lot of people might get the idea that native plantings are no maintenance, which isn't true. Any landscape planting, or especially in the face of invasive species, any native planting will need maintenance. Some plantings are easier to maintain than others, But while maintenance may drop off after establishment, which might take a couple years, especially for a native planting from seed, it still needs the care and thoughtful approach that you would have to any kind of land management or definitely landscape planting. Some things that can help with that public perception of native plants is showing care for maintenance, of course, having a defined border, whether that is a fence or a defined border with a walkway, and making sure that you're not planting natives that are too tall next to a walkway that they could like fall over and flop down and block the walkway. Having a defined border here, this one is turf grass. Elements of care like mulch, things that show intention. You can also educate neighbors and help do things like identification tags or signage. This is one that we have in our office. It's native plants at work. And there's also different certifications you can get to show care for your habitat. And I got my little note here to make sure you check covenants and ordinances, because there are some barriers in some communities and particularly some homeowners associations related to like tall grass ordinances or things like that. So it's always good to check first. And then if there are barriers as far as covenants and ordinance go, there are a lot of resources too that we can help with to help people educate neighbors or their city or their HOA to try to break down some of those barriers to make the community more friendly for native plantings. So I've got some photos here, some examples of some of those elements of care. You can see like this strong border here, turf grass, and then mulch, bird houses, or they've got a little bird bath here, shows intention and care. Again, really strong border with mulch and rocks here with this little path on this island garden between this corner. Taller plants in the back, shorter plants in the front here. This is kind of like a side yard area that is not being used as much. Some people might not be able to do a big landscape bed or convert part of their yard, but there might be something that's a little more out of sight that you might be more comfortable starting with. That kind of area. It's still really important to provide habitat and native plants, but maybe not as prominent. Some other more prominent examples here, of course, everyone can't replace their front yard with native plants, but this is a good example here at the bottom of a really tough area. We call it the hell strip between the street and the sidewalk. Gets a lot of road salt, gets kind of beaten up by cars and parking and foot traffic. The soil is pretty rocky and usually not very good, but it's possible to find natives that can thrive in that environment. So a lot of really, really good options there. And these can also be great projects for schools, churches, homeowners association, common areas. Great way to get kids involved and start teaching the next generation and helping them foster a relationship with nature and understand and appreciate native plants and the wildlife that depends on them, and understanding invasive species and why they're important to try to manage. Large pollinator gardens are great, especially we work on this a lot with the churches and homeowners associations that are using a lot of money and time to water or treat or mow really large turf grass areas. Whenever there are opportunities to convert that to native plantings that can serve as recreation space or improve water quality, or in the case of mowing, actually reduce maintenance costs whenever you go from mowing weekly a acreage of turf grass to implementing a native planting. And things like rain gardens or pond edge plantings have a lot of benefits too, associated with water quality improvements on top of the pollinator benefits as well. So of course there are a lot of challenges too. A lot of those native invasives that we talked about are going to be trying to invade this area. So that's another thing, that can be a challenge for maintenance, but investing in promoting and protecting and reinvigorating these kind of habitats with native species is really important. So yeah, why do this when you can have this? Another point I always like to make as well, if you see that there are holes in the leaves of your plants, that's a good thing. It means it's working. What we're trying to do with these natives and provide this habitat is trying to attract insects and pollinators. So seeing some damage is actually good, some damage. So when anytime we're trying to support pollinators or native plants, we want to avoid pesticides and insecticides as much as we can. And kind of work to break down that perception that all landscape plants have to be bug-free and perfectly intact. To implement some of this stuff, finding native plants is getting easier and easier each year, which is really exciting. You can collect your own seed. Of course, you need permission, you know, if it's not your property, but there are parks. Usually, I know in Hamilton County, I think they do it at Cool Creek and Patawee, where they have days that you can come out and collect seed, and they keep a portion, but you get to take a portion home. Always encourage people as far as plants go to purchase from reputable sources. A study a few years ago found that over half of the species or plants from a big box home and garden store were treated with persistent neonicotinoid pesticides. So they were, you know, labeled as pollinator friendly, but actually treated with chemicals that were systemic and could actually kill pollinators. So I encourage people to ask questions, ask if they were treated with neonicotinoids, ask if you have native plants at a retailer, ask for natives at local nurseries so that they know that it's something that's important to you and they know that there's a market there for those plants. There's been some shifts in recent years with the new terrestrial plant rule, which isn't what we're here to get into tonight, but it has stopped the sale of some invasive plant species in Indiana, but there are some that are still out there. A prominent example is the Calorie pear. So it's not banned from being sold, but we can kind of vote with our dollar by not purchasing those plants and encouraging friends and neighbors not to purchase those plants. And then if enough, you know, if there's no market for it, then they'll stop being sold because these landscape, you know, stores are going to be selling what people buy. So events like this and sharing the information you get with friends and neighbors are really important to shift that market from these non-native invasives or non-native plants that we don't know if they're invasive yet, shift that to native plants that we know more about. There's a page on the SWCD website about where to buy native plants, and also a great program is growindiananatives.org. There is a listing, a statewide listing of retailers who have submitted their plant lists and they sell native plants, but they don't sell any prohibited invasive species. And there's actually some landscape designers as well who design with native plants. And there's also a really cool program for whenever you're growing native plants, you have your own native plant garden, you can actually get it registered for free and be part of the Grow Native program and purchase a really cool sign that you can display by your native plants that says, I grow Indiana natives. I also wanted to point out too some resources that are available on the HIP website, but we go through the top 5 invasive species that we talked about today and offer native alternatives as well. So those cards kind of give you a good kind of simple go-to that you could make note of or screenshot whenever you go shopping for plants or are shopping online so that you're finding good native alternatives to some of those invasives. So towards the end here, I just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about Hamilton County Invasives Partnership. I know a lot of you are already members or on our mailing list, but the partnership is a coalition or collaborative of land stewards and managers, municipal partners, parks departments, conservation organizations, all kinds of different groups and people, and just really, you know, passionate or interested landowners that are working to share information on invasive species, management and control strategies, and just address more broadly in a more impactful way the invasive species crisis in Hamilton County. So it's a cooperative invasive species management area, which is a SISMA. They have been starting in counties all across the state, and HIP was started in 2019. And we have a really active education and technical committees. So we are welcoming people to our monthly meetings. And then we also have education and technical committee meetings as well, but it's a great place to learn more about invasives in general. We have education components to each of our meetings, but also learn about what these different groups are doing for invasive species across the county and how we're all working together to address invasive species. You don't have to be part of an organization. You know, the majority of the members of HIP are just passionate landowners or property managers that want to be part of the fight against invasive species. We also have what we call a strike team, which is like our trained volunteer force that goes out and does targeted management of invasive species on different sites across the county. We have volunteer opportunities. We have volunteer invasive species work days that we call weed wrangles that our partners host all across the county. There are actually 2 coming up this Saturday, one at Dillon Park in Noblesville and one at Cool Creek in Carmel. So that'd be a great way to kind of jump right in. These are led by experts, so it's a really great opportunity to learn about invasive species, learn the ID, learn the management, but then, you know, jump right in and be actively involved with management so you can kind of, you know, learn with support and improve some of these parks properties, but then take that information home to work on invasive eradication on your own property. As part of HIP on the technical side, we also offer invasive species assessments. These are primarily for like larger properties, you know, not typically just a residential parcel, but we have some trained staff that can go through and assess the invasive species on your property and the native plants for that matter, and help develop a plan for control or management and help you prioritize where to start, which is really helpful to have some support with at the beginning, because sometimes it can be hard to know the best management strategies for sure, but it can be hard to know what locations or what species you should tackle first. So that's something that's also available. And I also wanted to point out on the tool loan program that's run through the SWCD. There's links posted that I'll share, but we have a variety of invasive species management tools, particularly our puller bars, which clamp down on the base of an invasive shrub like honeysuckle and use leverage of this long bar to actually pop it out by the root. So that's a really great way, particularly to tackle smaller invasive shrubs, but you don't have to use any herbicide. But there are some other tools that are relevant to invasive species management as well. Got some pictures here of some of our lovely volunteers, some weed wrangle photos. Also as part of the Invasive Species Awareness Week, this past week, we kind of had the launch of our first boot brush station, which is at Cool Creek Park. So there's invasive species signage and a brush down there at the bottom that you can use to clean your hiking boots before you go out on the trail and as you come back out, to limit the spread of invasive species seeds via our shoes. So yeah, that's some of what HIP is working on right now. I wanted to share my contact information, of course, but I also have the websites and social media channels for both the Soil and Water Conservation District and the Hamilton County Invasives Partnership. So I would encourage you guys to check out the new HIP website, but also follow our social media channels, and sharing the information you see there is a great way to help spread the message of invasive plants and native plants to your friends and neighbors, and introduce the concept to them as well, and help connect them with resources. I'll take questions in the chat box if you guys have any follow-up questions, but I also wanted to point out again this website. It's a page on our HIP website but there's a variety of resources that I've mentioned, and links to resources that I mentioned in the presentation tonight, and also a copy of the presentation slides. I will be adding everyone that joined us this evening onto the HIP mailing list, but I definitely encourage you to check out all of the awesome resources we have on the HIP website. And really, you know, hope you guys will check out our meeting schedule. And if you're new to the idea of invasives or want to learn more and want to be more actively involved with invasive species management on your own property or elsewhere in the county, I encourage you to join us and hopefully join us at that next meeting in June and be part of the invasive species solution in Hamilton County. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us. It's almost 8, so right on time. I'd happily take any questions. But otherwise, you can also follow up with questions via email or our social media channels. But really appreciate you guys taking your time to be with us this evening. Hey, I don't know why I'm typing out the response to this. I can just talk to you. I haven't seen butterfly bush really personally escaping cultivation, but I know that it's not, there are a lot better choices as far as the habitat and food supply for pollinators and wildlife. I mean, I've definitely heard people talking about its invasiveness, but it's not one that I have seen a lot personally, around here at least. I could find out more about that too. I have a couple experts that have, a lot more knowledge about what they're seeing more like widespread across the state.